A heavy travel bag didn't just fall into her lap. It was dropped with a thud of finality. A deliberate act of aggression at 35,000 feet, fueled by a simmering rage that had been building since takeoff. The woman who dropped it with her perfectly coiffed hair and expensive jewelry sneered, "You can hold this. You people should be used to carrying burdens." She expected tears, a quiet submission, perhaps a frantic call for a flight attendant. What she got instead was a moment of crystalline silence, a pair of eyes that turned from weary to laser-focused, and the calm, chilling response that would not only unravel her world, but would become a legendary tale of karma in the skies. Because she didn't just dump her luggage on a passenger. She had just assaulted a ghost, a woman who held the power to ground airlines and end careers with a single damning report. The recycled air of the Boeing 777 hummed its monotonous song, a white noise lullaby for the 100 souls crossing the Atlantic on the red-eye from JFK to Heathrow. For Dr. Annalise Jordan, it was the final leg of a grueling 2-week trip. She was a woman who lived in the precise, calculated world of aeronautical stress tolerances and metallurgical fatigue. Her mind was a fortress of data and regulations, but her body was succumbing to the simple human need for rest. She had purposefully booked seat 24C, an aisle seat in the premium economy cabin, a small but necessary luxury that allowed her long legs to stretch and gave her the freedom to get up without disturbing anyone. The middle seat 24B was blessedly empty. A green check mark on her boarding pass had confirmed it a small gift from the universe, a pocket of personal space in the cramped metal tube hurtling through the stratosphere. Annalise had already settled in her noise-cancelling headphones, resting on her lap, a well-worn copy of a technical journal open on her tray table. She was a portrait of quiet professionalism, her dark suit jacket neatly folded in the overhead bin, her silk blouse uncreased and her hair pulled back in an elegant twist. The last trickle of passengers was boarding their faces a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. That's when she first saw them, Caroline and Todd Becker. They moved down the aisle, not like travelers, but like feudal lords inspecting their domain. Caroline, a woman in her late 50s, with a face tightened by surgery and displeasure, led the way. Her platinum blonde hair was a rigid helmet, and her fingers, heavy with diamonds, clutched a designer handbag like a weapon. Her husband Todd trailed in her wake, a man whose expensive suit and timid eyes suggested a life spent apologizing for the space his wife took up. Their seats were 24A and 24D window, and aisle seats across from each other. Annalise felt a faint prickle of unease as Caroline's gaze swept over her, lingered for a moment too long, and then settled on the empty middle seat beside her. It was a look Annalise knew all too well, a quick, dismissive appraisal, followed by the dawning of a perceived opportunity. "Excuse me." Caroline's voice was sharp, cutting through the cabin's low murmur. She didn't speak to Annalise, but rather at her. "My husband and I would like to sit together. You'll need to move." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Annalise looked up from her journal, her expression neutral. "I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat." Caroline's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched. "And that a one," she said, pointing a lacquered nail at 24B, "is empty. It would be much more convenient if you just moved over so my husband can sit here." She gestured to Annalise's aisle seat. The implication was clear. Annalise and her assigned seat were an inconvenience. The empty seat was a solution, but only if Annalise rearranged herself to fit Caroline's desires. "I'd prefer to keep my aisle seat, thank you." Annalise replied, her voice calm and even. She had paid for this specific seat for a reason. After days of navigating foreign airports and living out of a suitcase, this small comfort was non-negotiable. Todd Becker shuffled his feet, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Honey, maybe I can just take the window seat and we can talk across the aisle." "Don't be ridiculous, Todd." Caroline snapped her voice loud enough to make a nearby passenger look up. She turned her glare back to Annalise. "I don't see what the problem is. It's just a seat. It's not like you paid extra for it." The microaggression hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "It's not like you paid extra for it." Annalise's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Oh, but she had. Her company had. And more than that, she had earned it. But she refused to be baited. "Ma'am, I'm staying in my seat," Annalise stated with quiet finality. She put on her headphones, a clear signal that the conversation was over. Caroline huffed a sound of pure, unadulterated indignation. Defeated for the moment, she squeezed past to her window seat, while Todd took his aisle seat across from Annalise. For the next 20 minutes, as the cabin crew prepared for takeoff, Annalise could feel Caroline's stare burning into the side of her head. She didn't look. She just breathed, focusing on the familiar pre-flight safety demonstration, a ritual she had seen 1,000 times. The plane taxied, rumbled, and then roared into the night sky over Queens. The battle for seat 24C, Annalise thought, was over. She was wrong. It had only just begun. The ascent was smooth. The lights of New York City became a glittering tapestry below, before vanishing beneath a blanket of clouds. The captain, a man with a reassuring baritone voice, named Robert Madsen, announced they had reached their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The seatbelt sign pinged off. A collective sigh of relief and the rustle of movement filled the cabin. Annalise kept her headphones on, but no music was playing. She was an observer by nature and by profession, and her senses were on high alert. Across the aisle, Caroline Becker was already in quiet, furious motion. She had her overhead light on, illuminating her space with a harsh, interrogative glare. She spoke to her husband in a vicious whisper that was perfectly audible in the relative quiet of the cabin. "I can't believe the nerve. Utterly classless," she hissed. "This whole section has gone to the dogs. Paying all this money for premium and you still have to deal with that." Todd mumbled something, placating his words, lost in the engine's drone. Annalise focused on a paragraph detailing fuselage stress cracks in aging aircraft, but the words blurred. The animosity rolling off Caroline was a palpable force, a cold front moving down the aisle. The drink service began. A flight attendant named Brenda, a woman with a kind but weary face that spoke of 1,000 such flights, pushed her cart down the aisle. When she reached their row, Caroline put on a dazzlingly fake smile. "I'll have a Chardonnay," she said, then gestured with her glass toward Annalise. "And I'm sure she will want something to calm her down." Brenda glanced at Annalise, who simply shook her head. "Just some water, please." The interaction was a performance for an unseen audience, a way for Caroline to frame Annalise as the aggressor, the difficult one. Annalise accepted the water with a polite thank you, her movements economical and precise. She would not give this woman any ammunition. She would be a ghost, a non-entity. But Caroline wouldn't allow it. Having lost the battle for the seat, she was now launching a campaign to conquer the space around it. First it was her coat, a large, puffy designer parka that she draped over the back of the empty middle seat, its sleeve deliberately flopping onto Annalise's armrest. Annalise subtly shifted, moving the sleeve back. A few minutes later, it was Caroline's magazine placed on the middle seat, but creeping over the invisible line. Annalise slid it back. Each encroachment was a tester poke to see if the bear would roar. Annalise refused. She remained a statue of placid endurance. This seemed to infuriate Caroline more than any argument could. Her frustration was curdling into something uglier, more volatile. She finished her first glass of Chardonnay quickly and was on her second before the cart had even reached the back of the cabin. Her voice grew louder, her gestures more expansive. She was complaining to Todd about everything: the temperature, the wine quality, the recline of her seat. But her eyes kept flicking back to Annalise and the empty seat that had become a symbol of her thwarted will. Then came the luggage. Caroline had a secondary carry-on, a heavy overstuffed duffel bag that had been jammed under the seat in front of her. With a grunt of effort, she pulled it out into the aisle. It was a bulky, cumbersome thing, straining at the seams. "Todd, I need more room for my feet," she declared loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I can't be expected to sit like this all night." Before Todd could respond, Caroline stood up, hoisted the heavy bag, and turned. For a split second, her eyes met Annalise's. In them, Annalise saw a flash of raw, triumphant malice. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a slip. With a deliberate, forceful shove, Caroline Becker dumped the entire weight of the duffel bag directly onto Annalise's lap. The impact was a dull, heavy shock that knocked the breath from her lungs. The bag was far heavier than it looked, filled with hard-edged objects, books perhaps, or shoes. One corner dug sharply into her thigh. Her open journal went flying, and her cup of water tipped over, sending a cold splash across her slacks. The cabin, which had been filled with the low hum of conversation and entertainment, went suddenly quiet. Heads turned. The young man in the row behind a college student named Leo Schmidt, with his phone already in his hand, instinctively angled his camera. For a moment, Annalise was just stunned. The sheer audacity of the act was breathtaking. It was a physical assault, a blatant act of dominance and disrespect. Caroline stood over her, a smirk playing on her lips. She looked down at Annalise, pinned in her seat by the bag, and delivered the line that would seal her fate. "There," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You can hold this. You people should be used to carrying burdens." A collective gasp went through the nearby rows. The racism, once a subtle poison, was now a naked blade. Todd Becker's face went from pale to ashen. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Annalise looked down at the bag on her lap. Then slowly, deliberately, she looked back up at Caroline. Her weariness was gone, vaporized by a surge of ice-cold adrenaline. The PhD in aerospace engineering, the traveler. The tired woman on her way home, all of that receded. What was left was the investigator. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of observation and analysis, began to record everything. The time on the cabin clock, the woman's face, her exact words, the shocked faces of the surrounding passengers. She took a slow, deep breath, not of anger, but of focus. And in the ringing silence, Annalise Jordan prepared to go to work. The silence in the cabin stretched for a taut, unbearable 10 seconds. It was broken not by Annalise, but by an older gentleman in seat 25C, a man with a military-style haircut and a ramrod straight posture. "What in the hell do you think you're doing, lady?" His voice boomed, the kind of command that expected to be obeyed. This was Mr. Henderson, a retired Marine colonel on his way to visit his grandchildren in London. He was already half out of his seat, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Caroline whirled on him. This is none of your business, old man. Mind yourself. Assaulting a passenger is my business. It's everyone's business. He shot back, his voice unwavering. Up in the galley, the commotion had finally registered. Brenda, the flight attendant, came rushing down the aisle, her face etched with alarm. "What's going on here? Please, everyone, let's keep our voices down." Her eyes fell on the scene, Annalise still pinned by the heavy bag, her pants soaked with water. Caroline standing over her defiant, Mr. Henderson ready to intervene. "Ma'am," Brenda said, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed Caroline. "You can't do this. Please take your bag." "It's not hurting anyone," Caroline sniffed, crossing her arms. There was no other place for it. This woman has the whole middle seat to herself. It's the least she can do. She was already rewriting the narrative, painting herself as a victim of circumstance, forced into action by Annalise's selfishness. Annalise finally spoke. Her voice was unnervingly calm, devoid of the hysteria Caroline clearly expected. It was the voice she used when questioning a non-compliant engineer or an evasive maintenance chief. "Remove your bag from my person. Now!" Each word was a perfectly polished stone, hard and unyielding. The sheer authority in her tone made Brenda flinch. "Just take the bag, honey," Todd Becker pleaded from across the aisle, his voice a desperate whisper. "Please, just stop this." Caroline ignored him. "She needs to be taught a lesson in sharing. Some people are just so entitled." The irony of her statement was so profound, it was almost comical. Brenda, caught between a rock and a hard place, defaulted to the path of least resistance. It was a critical and disastrous miscalculation. She turned her focus from the aggressor to the victim. "Miss," she said, her eyes pleading with Annalise, "I'm so sorry about this, but for the sake of keeping the peace, would you be willing to perhaps just put the bag on the floor for her? Or maybe we could find you another seat." Annalise stared at Brenda. She saw not malice but weakness. She saw a woman trained in customer service, not conflict resolution. A woman whose primary directive was to de-escalate, even if it meant validating the aggressor. In that moment, Brenda wasn't just a flight attendant. She was the embodiment of a system that so often asks the target of abuse to accommodate the abuser for the sake of a quiet life. "Let me be perfectly clear," Annalise said, her voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous register. "I will not be moving. I will not be touching this bag. And I will not be keeping the peace by accepting assault. This woman," she locked eyes with Caroline, "violated my personal space and placed her property on me without my consent. That is the issue. It is the only issue. You need to compel her to rectify it." Meanwhile, 3 rows back, Leo Schmidt had his phone held steady. He was capturing it all. Brenda's faltering attempts at mediation, Caroline's belligerent posturing, Todd's pathetic hand-wringing, and Annalise's incredible, steely composure. He knew with the certainty of his generation that this was more than just an argument. This was a viral moment in the making. Mr. Henderson, seeing Brenda's ineffectiveness, spoke up again. "Flight attendant, this passenger has committed an assault. Your airline's policy and federal law dictates a zero-tolerance policy for this behavior. You need to inform the captain immediately." The mention of federal law seemed to finally penetrate Brenda's panic. Her eyes widened. This was escalating beyond a simple passenger dispute. I'll have to get the purser," she stammered before turning and practically fleeing toward the front of the plane. Caroline sneered, emboldened by the flight attendant's retreat. "See, she's on my side. She knows you're the one making a scene." Annalise didn't respond. She simply sat there, the weight of the bag a constant physical reminder of the violation. She didn't try to push it off. That would involve a physical struggle, and she would not sink to that level. The bag was evidence. It was Exhibit A. Let it sit. Let everyone see it. Let them all bear witness to what had happened in the dimmed lights of the cabin miles above the earth. The wheels of justice she knew were often slow, but the wheels of karma, especially at this altitude, were about to get a jet-assisted takeoff. As Brenda scurried away, a new kind of quiet descended. It was the tense anticipatory silence of a courtroom before the verdict is read. Caroline, mistaking the lack of immediate consequences for victory, finally retrieved her bag from Annalise's lap with a dramatic, put-upon sigh. She stuffed it aggressively under the middle seat, muttering about drama queens and people who can't take a joke. She sat back in her window seat, a smug look of triumph on her face. She picked up her wine, took a theatrical sip, and pointedly ignored Annalise. In her mind, the incident was over. She had asserted her dominance, created a fuss, and the problem passenger had been put in her place. She could not have been more wrong. For Annalise Jordan, the incident was just beginning. The initial shock and anger had been transmuted into something far more potent professional focus. The cabin was no longer a passenger space. It was a field site. The people around her were no longer just travelers. They were witnesses and subjects. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in defeat, but in concentration. Her mind, trained to deconstruct complex system failures, began to deconstruct the event, cataloguing every detail with chilling precision. Item 1. The perpetrator, Caroline Becker, female, late 50s, exhibited escalating aggression following a denied request. Used racially coded language, "you people." Committed a deliberate physical act classified as simple assault. Justification provided was nonsensical, indicating the act was punitive, not practical. Subject appears to be under the influence of alcohol, but not to the point of incapacitation. Her husband, Todd Becker, acted as a passive enabler. Item 2. The initial response. Flight attendant Brenda Walsh. Annalise had noted her name from her uniform tag earlier. Response inadequate. Failed to identify the primary aggressor. Attempted to appease the aggressor by placing a burden on the victim. Showed a lack of training in handling passenger-on-passenger assault and harassment. Did not immediately notify the captain or flight deck a potential protocol breach. Item 3. The witnesses. Seat 25C Mr. Henderson, male 60s, 70s. Former military inferred from posture and terminology. Intervened verbally in support of the victim. Correctly identified the act as assault and cited the need to involve the captain and law. A credible witness. Seat 27G. Leo Schmidt, male, early 20s. Recorded the incident on a personal electronic device, a critical source of objective evidence. Other surrounding passengers' faces showed shock, discomfort, and fear. Their silence was also a data point, the bystander effect in a closed environment. Item 4. The Federal Aviation Regulations, FARs. Her mind scrolled through them as if reading a textbook. 49. U.S. Code or FALS 46504. Interference with flight crew members and attendants. Caroline's belligerent behavior, her refusal to follow a crew member's initial, albeit weak, instructions, and the creation of a disturbance, all fell under this statute. A felony. 49. U.S. Code FAL 46506. Assault or piracy. While this often refers to more severe acts, the language covers assault. The act was intentional, offensive, and physical. Airline's own contract of carriage. Annalise knew that every airline has clauses about refusing to transport or removing passengers who are disruptive, abusive, or who interfere with the duties of the crew. This was not just a case of a rude passenger anymore. This was a chain of failures. A failure of civility on Caroline's part. A failure of training on Brenda's part. A failure of the system to protect a passenger from harm. And Annalise Jordan's job, the very core of her professional existence, was to analyze failures to prevent them from ever happening again. The safety of the national airspace system depended on adherence to rules, protocols, and a fundamental baseline of order. Caroline Becker hadn't just dumped a bag on a woman's lap. She had taken a sledgehammer to that order. Annalise subtly retrieved her company-issued phone. Keeping it low and out of sight, she opened a secure, encrypted note-taking app. Her fingers moved silently and swiftly across the screen, a stark contrast to her calm exterior. Incident log. Flight BA 112, JFK LHR. Date. Current date. Time, approx 22:40. ES2, location. Seat 24C, premium economy. Subject, Caroline Becker. Seat 24A. Event unprovoked assault, following verbal dispute over seating. Subject dropped heavy carry-on luggage onto my person. Verbatim quote, "You people should be used to carrying burdens." Crew response, FAA Brenda Walsh. Inadequate. Attempted to mediate by asking victim to accommodate aggressor. Witnesses Henderson, 25C, Schmidt, 27G video evidence. Violations. Potential. FAR, 46504, 46506. She documented it all. Coldly. Clinically. Each tap of the screen was another nail being hammered into Caroline Becker's coffin of consequences. Annalise wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was an investigator on active duty. This flight was no longer a simple transport. It was a mobile incident site. And she had all the evidence she needed. All that was left was to wait for the chain of command to arrive. She saw the purser, a stern-looking man with silver hair, making his way down the aisle with Brenda trailing nervously behind him. The next phase was about to begin. Annalise took a sip of the fresh water. Another passenger had quietly passed to her, her pulse as steady as a chronometer. The purser, whose name tag read David, arrived with an air of practiced authority. He had the weary but firm expression of a man who had seen every conceivable form of human misbehavior at 35,000 feet. "Good evening, Edith," he said, his voice a low, controlled balm, intended to soothe the situation. He addressed the space between Annalise and Caroline. "My name is David. I'm the cabin service director. I understand there's been some disagreement." Caroline immediately launched into her performance. "Disagreement. This woman is a menace. I made a simple request, and she's been nothing but hostile. She's making everyone uncomfortable. She spilled water all over herself just for dramatic effect." David listened patiently, his eyes flicking from Caroline's theatrical outrage to Annalise's statuesque calm. He then turned to Annalise. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened from your perspective?" Annalise looked at David, then at Brenda, who was hovering nervously behind him, refusing to make eye contact. She decided to give them one last chance to handle this correctly. "That woman," Annalise began, her voice level and clear, "accosted me during boarding. demanding my seat. When I declined, she spent the first hour of this flight engaged in passive-aggressive behavior. She then escalated matters by deliberately dropping her heavy duffel bag onto my lap, causing my water to spill. She accompanied this action with a racially motivated insult. Your flight attendant, Brenda, witnessed the aftermath. Her proposed solution was to ask me to move or to accommodate the aggressor. David's expression tightened. He had hoped for a simple, she said, that could be solved with a complimentary drink voucher and a forced apology. This was something else entirely. The mention of a racial slur and a physical act, coupled with a critique of his crew's response, elevated the situation into a serious complaint. I see, he said slowly. Well, this is a difficult situation. Caroline, I must insist that you'll insist on nothing. Caroline interrupted, her voice rising again. My husband is a very important man. Todd, tell him who you are. Todd Becker looked like a deer in the headlights. Honey, please, let's just... No. They need to know who they're dealing with. Todd is the Executive Vice President for North American Logistics at AeroCorp Dynamics. They supply half the ground support equipment to this airline. One phone call from him and you, she sneered at David, will be reassigned to cleaning toilets on the tarmac. The threat hung in the air. David's face became an impassive mask, but Annalise could see a flicker of concern in his eyes. AeroCorp Dynamics was a major contractor. This was no idle threat. The power dynamics in the cabin had just shifted. Caroline, believing she had played her trump card, leaned back with a look of utter confidence. David took a deep breath. Ma'am, your husband's position has no bearing on passenger conduct regulations. I'm going to have to report this to the captain. He turned to leave. You do that, Caroline called after him. Tell him to come back here and apologize to me. Annalise knew this was the critical moment. The situation had reached the highest authority on the aircraft. It was time. As David turned, she spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. Cabin director. David stopped and turned back. Before you speak to Captain Madsen, Annalise said, using the captain's name she had overheard during the pre-flight announcement. There is something both you and he need to be aware of. She reached into the slim leather portfolio by her feet. It was the only piece of luggage she kept with her, containing her laptop and critical documents. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. Caroline watched with a look of amused contempt, as if expecting Annalise to pull out a complaint form. Annalise retrieved a small, hard-backed credential case. She flipped it open. Inside, behind a clear pane, was a photo ID and a gold seal of a government agency, unmistakable and imposing. She held it up for David to see. Her eyes, however, were locked on Caroline. My name, she said, her voice resonating with an authority that dwarfed Caroline's borrowed power, is Dr. Annalise Jordan. I'm a senior air safety investigator with the United States Federal Aviation Administration National Transportation Safety Board liaison. The bombshell landed with a deafening silence. David's jaw literally dropped. He squinted at the credentials, his professional composure shattering into raw shock. He looked from the ID to Annalise's face and back again. The color drained from his face. Brenda, the flight attendant, let out a small, strangled gasp and put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer terror. She hadn't just failed to help a passenger. She had mishandled a federal officer during the commission of an in-flight incident. Henderson, the retired Marine, let out a low whistle of appreciation. Leo Schmidt, still filming, zoomed in on the ID, then on Caroline's face, capturing the exact moment her world tilted off its axis. Caroline Becker stared, her smug expression melting away like wax. The words seemed alien, nonsensical. FAA investigator. It didn't compute. You're lying, she stammered, but her voice lacked all conviction. Annalise didn't even grace her with a response. She was addressing David, now her tone shifting from passenger to official. Cabin Director David, you now have a federal officer on board who has been the victim of an assault and a clear violation of FAR 46504. Your crew's response was insufficient and will be noted in my report. I need you to inform Captain Madsen that he has an active Level 2 security incident in the cabin and that I require a direct conference with him. I also need you to secure the names of all passengers in the surrounding rows as witnesses. And you, she turned her gaze to Brenda, will bring me 2 copies of a full incident report form. Now! The authority was absolute. It was the voice of the government, the voice of the rule book, that governed their very existence in the sky. David, snapping back to attention, simply nodded, his face pale. Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am. He turned and almost ran toward the cockpit. Across the aisle, Todd Becker had his head in his hands, his face a sickly green. He wasn't looking at his wife. He was looking at the smoldering ruins of his career. AeroCorp Dynamics did more than just sell ground equipment. They had multi-billion-dollar contracts with the Department of Defense and the FAA itself. His wife hadn't just assaulted a black woman. She had assaulted their oversight. Caroline sat frozen, her mouth agape, the color gone from her face. The power she had wielded so arrogantly moments before had evaporated, revealed to be a cheap imitation of the real crushing authority now sitting across from her. She had picked a fight with a passenger, and she had just discovered that passenger was the referee, the judge, and the jury. The transformation in the cabin was instantaneous and absolute. Annalise was no longer just a passenger in seat 24C. She was the gravitational center of the aircraft. The crew who had previously been trying to manage a dispute were now operating with the brisk, nervous efficiency of people under official scrutiny. Captain Robert Madsen appeared within 2 minutes. He wasn't a man who typically visited the cabin for passenger issues, but David's frantic message over the intercom FAA on board Level 2 incident had brought him out of the cockpit at a speed just shy of a run. He was tall with silver hair and a captain's air of command, but right now his face was all business and deep concern. He bypassed Caroline completely and addressed Annalise directly, his voice low and respectful. Dr. Jordan, I'm Captain Madsen. I am so incredibly sorry for what you've experienced on my flight. My purser has given me the initial details. How can we assist you? Captain, Annalise replied, her tone professional and direct. What I require is simple. First, I need this passenger. She gestured toward Caroline, who flinched as if struck to be moved to a different seat, as far away from me as possible. Her continued presence here constitutes an ongoing source of intimidation. Of course, Captain Madsen said immediately. He turned to David. Find another seat. Back of the aircraft. Now. But my husband, Caroline protested, her voice a weak, reedy thing. Your husband will remain here, the captain said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You will be separated. 2 other flight attendants appeared, and with grim-faced politeness compelled Caroline to gather her things. Stripped of her arrogance, she looked small and pathetic as they escorted her down the aisle, on a walk of shame, the eyes of every passenger following her. She didn't look back. Once she was gone, Annalise continued. Second Captain, You need to follow protocol for an unruly passenger incident. That means you are required to notify your airline's security department and law enforcement at our destination. I expect officers to meet this flight upon arrival at the gate at Heathrow." "Already in motion, Dr. Jordan," the captain confirmed. "Our dispatch is coordinating with airport police at Heathrow as we speak. We're transmitting the initial report now." "Good." Annalise nodded. "My full official report will follow. It will include a detailed assessment of the incident itself and of your crew's response to it." She glanced at Brenda, who looked like she was about to be physically ill. "Specifically, the failure to identify the aggressor and the attempt to placate them by inconveniencing the victim. That is a training issue that needs to be addressed airline-wide." Captain Madson's face was grim. "I understand, and it will be addressed, I assure you. My crew will provide you with their full cooperation and written statements." With the immediate situation under control, the captain retreated to the cockpit to manage the official communications. The atmosphere in Annalise's section of the cabin shifted again. The tension dissipated, replaced by a buzz of awe and relief. Mr. Henderson leaned forward. "Ma'am," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "That was the most beautiful thing I've seen in 30 years of flying. Well done." "Thank you for speaking up, Mr. Henderson," Annalise replied with a warm, genuine smile. "It's important for people to do that." Then Leo Schmidt, the young student, approached her seat, his phone in his hand. "Dr. Jordan, I'm Leo. I got the whole thing on video. The bag, what she said, everything. It's crystal clear." Annalise looked at him and her professional demeanor softened. "Mr. Schmidt, you may have just become the most valuable witness in this case. Would you be willing to provide me with a copy of that footage?" "Are you kidding?" Leo said, his eyes wide. "I'll airdrop it to you right now. It would be an honor." As the video file transferred, Annalise felt a profound sense of the world shifting. 20 years ago, this would have been her word against Caroline's. It would have been a forgotten incident, a miserable flight she would have had to swallow and move on from. But now, with digital evidence and the power of her position, the tables had not just been turned, they had been smashed to pieces. Todd Becker sat across the aisle, a man utterly broken. He looked over at Annalise, his eyes swimming with a pathetic mix of fear and desperation. "Dr. Jordan," he began, his voice cracking. "I am so sorry. Caroline, she gets like this. She didn't mean it." Annalise looked at him, her face devoid of pity. "Mr. Becker, your wife is a grown woman, responsible for her actions and her words. And you, sir, stood by and did nothing. Your apology is noted, but it is irrelevant. This is no longer a personal matter between passengers. Your wife assaulted a federal officer, displayed racial animus, and interfered with a flight crew. The consequences for that are not mine to forgive." Todd slumped back in his seat, as if she had physically pushed him. He pulled out his phone and began typing a frantic, lengthy text message, his thumbs trembling. He was likely informing his company's legal department that a Category 5 hurricane, which his wife had personally seeded, was about to make landfall on their corporate headquarters. For the remaining 5 hours of the flight, Annalise's section was an oasis of calm. Flight attendants checked on her every 20 minutes, offering drinks, snacks, anything she might want. Other passengers would pass by on their way to the lavatory and give her a quiet thumbs up or a nod of respect. She had become a folk hero at 35,000 feet. Annalise, however, did not relax. She opened her laptop, connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi, and began to write. She typed with a furious, focused rhythm, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She was drafting the preliminary incident report for the FAA. She detailed every moment, every word, every failure. It was precise, meticulous, and utterly damning. She was building a cage of words and regulations, and with every sentence she slid another steel bar into place. By the time the sun began to rise, tinting the clouds outside her window with shades of orange and pink, the report was nearly complete, and as the coast of Ireland appeared below, signalling their approach to the British Isles, Annalise knew that Caroline Becker's in-flight judgment was over. Her real-world reckoning was about to begin. The descent into London was shrouded in the city's typical grey morning mist, a soft, diffuse light that filled the cabin with a sense of liminality. The journey was ending, but the story was not. Inside the Boeing 777, the atmosphere was unlike any Annalise had ever experienced. The usual pre-landing bustle, the stowing of laptops, the rustle of jackets being retrieved from overhead bins, the cheerful chatter about plans was absent. It was replaced by a thick electric anticipation. Passengers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes flicking towards Annalise, then toward the back of the plane where Carolina had been sequestered, and then toward the front where they knew authority resided. They were no longer just travelers. They were the audience for the final act of a drama they had unexpectedly been cast in. Annalise remained in her seat, a picture of calm. Outwardly, she was reviewing notes on her laptop, but inwardly she was observing the final critical phase of the incident. There was no triumph in her no sense of victory. Instead, there was the quiet, weary satisfaction of a job done correctly. She had witnessed a systemic failure, documented it, and now she would see the protocol through to its conclusion. This was her world action-reaction and correction. The personal sting of the insult had long since been subsumed by the professional imperative to ensure order and safety. As the landing gear locked into place with a familiar heavy thud, Captain Madsen's voice came over the intercom. It was smooth and reassuring as always, but his words carried an unusual weight. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now on our final approach to London Heathrow. Cabin crew, please prepare for landing. A standard announcement followed by a pause that held everyone's breath. For operational reasons, he continued, his tone shifting from pilot to official. We ask that you please remain in your seats after the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate. Please do not stand up or retrieve your luggage from the overhead compartments until you are instructed to do so. We will be deplaning in a slightly different order this morning. We appreciate your cooperation and understanding. The message, delivered with calm finality, sent a clear signal through the cabin. This was not over. The landing was perfect, a gentle kiss of rubber on tarmac. The massive aircraft gracefully taxied towards its gate at Terminal 5. When the engines finally spooled down into silence, the quiet in the cabin became absolute. Every eye was fixed on the cabin door. Moments after the jet bridge connected with a soft bump, the door hissed open. But instead of the usual ground staff, 2 uniformed officers from London's Metropolitan Police stepped aboard, their high-visibility vests seeming impossibly bright in the cabin's dim light. They were followed by 2 stern-faced airline security officials. They moved with a practiced, no-nonsense efficiency, their presence turning the passenger jet into an official crime scene. The lead officer conferred quietly with David the purser, who pointed towards the rear of the plane. The 4 men began to walk down the aisle, their footsteps seeming unnaturally loud. As they passed Annalise, the senior officer gave her a brief, respectful nod, an acknowledgement from one professional to another. They found Caroline Becker, huddled in her new seat, trying to make herself invisible. Her helmet of hair was slightly askew, her makeup smudged. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a sullen, fearful resentment. "Ma'am, "Are you Caroline Becker?" the officer asked, his voice polite but unyielding. Caroline's head snapped up, a final flicker of her old defiance surfacing. "What is this about? We just need to ask you a few questions, ma'am," the officer replied, his patience clearly finite. "Please collect your personal belongings. You'll need to come with us." They then moved to Todd Becker's seat. He looked like a man who had aged a decade during the flight. He didn't protest. He simply stood, his movements stiff and robotic, his face ashen. He had already processed the end of his world and was merely waiting for the formalities. The couple was escorted to the front, their journey a walk of shame past the silent jury of their fellow passengers. As Caroline was led past row 24, her eyes burning with a venomous and undiluted hatred locked onto Annalise. It was a look that promised retribution, a final desperate attempt to assert some form of power. Annalise met her gaze without flinching, her expression, not of anger or triumph, but of blank professional indifference. To Annalise, Caroline Becker was no longer a person. She was a case file, a data point in a report on systemic failure. And that cool, dismissive calm was the most devastating blow of all. This, however, was only the beginning of the karma. The real life-altering consequences were already gathering speed far beyond the confines of the aircraft. The viral storm. Leo Schmidt, the student who had filmed everything, had spent the last hour of the flight wrestling with his conscience. When he saw the police board the plane and lead the Beckers away, his decision was made. This wasn't just gossip. It was an event that deserved to be seen. He edited the footage into a tight, devastating 1-minute clip. The arrogant demand for the seat, the thud of the dropped bag, Caroline's vile racist remark, Annalise's steely response, and the climactic, jaw-dropping reveal of the FAA credentials. He uploaded it to TikTok and Twitter with a simple factual caption: "Passenger harasses black woman on JFK LHR flight, discovers she's a high-ranking FAA investigator. Justice is served at 35,000 feet. Now flight, Karen, FAA." He posted it as he walked through the terminal. By the time he had cleared immigration, the video had 100,000 views. By the time he was in a taxi heading into London, it had passed 1 million and was trending globally. News outlets smelling blood in the water ripped the video and began broadcasting it. The internet, with its terrifying crowd-sourced efficiency, identified Caroline and Todd Becker within 45 minutes. His title, Executive VP at AeroCorp Dynamics, was plastered everywhere. Caroline Becker was no longer a private citizen. She was a public symbol of racist entitlement, her sneering face an avatar for a brand of arrogance the world loved to hate. The corporate implosion. The executives at AeroCorp Dynamics in Virginia woke up to a 5-alarm fire. Their company was trending for the worst possible reason. Their stock was already taking a hit in pre-market trading. Their carefully crafted corporate image of diversity and inclusion was being torched online. Worse, the victim was not just any citizen. She was a senior official from the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA was not just a government body. It was a key client and the agency whose regulations governed every single product they sold. Todd Becker's wife had not just started a fire. She had started it in a munitions depot. An emergency board meeting was convened via video conference at 6:00 a.m. The decision was unanimous and merciless. Todd, sitting in a drab, windowless holding room at Heathrow, was ordered to join the call. He saw the stone-cold faces of his CEO and the board members, and knew it was over. His stammered apologies were cut short. He was informed his employment was terminated, effective immediately for gross misconduct, and for bringing the corporation into catastrophic disrepute. His stock options were voided, his severance package rescinded. 30 years of corporate ladder climbing undone in a 7-hour flight. The legal hammer and systemic change. The Beckers were questioned and released, their passports confiscated, pending further investigation. But Annalise's official report, filed from her London hotel room, had already landed on desks in Washington, D.C. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic destruction, cold factual and meticulously cross-referenced with federal statutes and airline regulations. The Department of Justice acted swiftly. Caroline Becker was indicted on federal felony charges for violating 49 U.S. Code, SARA 46504. Interference with flight crew members and attendants. The prosecution's case was ironclad, built on the testimony of a federal officer and supported by viral video evidence seen by 50 million people. The airline, in a move to mitigate the damage from the inevitable FAA investigation, banned Caroline and Todd Becker for life and shared their names across their global alliance, making them no-fly pariahs on nearly every major carrier in the world. Just as Annalise's report had predicted, the FAA launched a full investigation into the airline's training protocols. The incident, now infamous, became a mandatory case study in their crew training curriculum, unofficially known as the Jordan scenario. Brenda, the flight attendant, was required to undergo extensive retraining. Her flawed response serving as a stark lesson for thousands of others on how not to handle an in-flight incident. The Beckers finally returned to the United States to a life scorched to the ground. Their social circle evaporated, their friends suddenly unavailable. Their country club membership was quietly revoked. They were forced to sell their sprawling mansion to pay the mounting legal fees. Caroline, once a titan of local charity galas, became a recluse haunted by the digital ghost of her own worst moment. A week later, Annalise Jordan finished her work in London. She arrived at Heathrow for her flight home and was met at the curb by the airline's station chief. She had been upgraded to their most exclusive first-class suite. Tucked into the seat was a handwritten letter from the airline's CEO offering his profound apology and assuring her that lasting changes were being implemented because of her. She read it, nodded, and settled in for the flight home. She hadn't sought revenge or fame. She had demanded accountability, and in doing so she became a quiet legend in the aviation world, a powerful reminder that in the confined, rule-bound society of the skies, you never ever know who you're sitting next to. That single act of malice born from prejudice and entitlement set off a chain reaction that the aggressor could never have imagined. It wasn't just about a bag dropped on a lap. It was about a lifetime of unchecked privilege finally meeting an immovable object of authority and integrity. Caroline Becker thought she was putting a lesser person in her place, but instead she exposed herself and her husband to a world that was tired of watching bullies win. The karma that hit them wasn't supernatural. It was systemic. It was the crushing, methodical power of the very rules and regulations that hold our society together. Their life of luxury and influence was built on a fragile foundation, and Dr. Annalise Jordan, with her quiet dignity and powerful credentials, simply held them accountable until it all crumbled into dust. If you believe that actions should have consequences and want to hear more stories where arrogance meets its match, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. And please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed an act of entitlement that backfired this spectacularly?